My name is Severin. They tell you that faith is a shield. They tell you that as long as you hold the image of the God Emperor in your heart, the darkness cannot touch you. I used to believe that. I used to believe that the ink staining my fingers was a holy sacrament, that every word I copied kept the demons at bay. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about the weight of truth in a world constructed entirely of necessary lies. I'm going to tell you about the day I looked into the machinery of our salvation and found nothing but gears grinding on bone. But before we descend into the black, promise me you will watch until the end. Because how this story concludes, the fate that befell me and the terrible choice I had to make, is a twist so devastating and unexpected, it will leave you speechless. You think you know what heresy is. You think you know the price of silence. Prepare yourself. The truth is heavier than any chain, and once you see what I saw, you will never look at the golden throne the same way again. The story begins now. Before we step into the darkness, leave a mark, a like or a subscription so I know someone is still listening out there in the void. Chapter 1. The Prayer Engine. The ink never really leaves your skin. It settles into the whorls of your fingerprints and the cracks around your nails, turning your hands into a permanent map of the scriptures you have copied. I had written the phrase, "The Emperor protects," 4,000 times that morning. It was not an act of devotion. It was a quota. The target was 5,000 lines before the shift change, and the penalty for failure was a reduction in rations. Scriptorium 404 was a cavernous wound in the belly of the hive city, a space so vast that the ceiling was lost in a smog of incense smoke and recycled breath. The only light came from the sputtering lumen globes that hung like dying stars, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the rows of scribes. We were not people here. We were biological components of a great machine, processing data that nobody read, copying prayers that nobody heard. The air tasted of ozone and dry parchment, a metallic tang that coated the back of the throat and made every swallow a reminder of where you were. There is a rhythm to the scriptorium. It is the sound of a million quills scratching against vellum, a sound like insects devouring dry leaves. It is the low throbbing hum of the ventilation fans that have been dying for centuries. I had learned to tune it out to let my hand move independently of my mind. Dip the quill. Right. The Emperor protects. Dip. Right. The Emperor protects. My wrist ached with a dull, throbbing fire that never truly went away, but pain was just another sensation to be ignored. We were taught that pain is the Emperor's touch, a reminder that we are still alive to serve. But looking at the bent backs of the men around me, listening to the wet coughs that punctuated the scratching silence, I didn't feel served. I felt processed. We were grinding ourselves down into dust, converting our life force into ink on a page, hoping that the sheer volume of our output would somehow tilt the balance of the galaxy in our favor. Then the rhythm broke. It was a subtle shift. At first a stutter in the mechanical chant of the cherub servitor hovering near my station. It was Unit 734, a small lobotomized cyborg designed to spray holy water and recite the litany of endurance. It had been clicking rhythmically for hours, a metronome for my misery. Suddenly, the clicking turned into a wet, grinding tear. The servitor froze in midair, its anti-grav motor whining in protest. Instead of the holy litany, a burst of high-pitched static screamed from its vox grill. The scribe next to me didn't even look up. To look up was to waste time. To waste time was to invite the whip. But I was the section overseer for this row. It was my burden to ensure the machinery of faith kept turning. I put down my quill, the sudden absence of motion feeling wrong in my hand. and signaled for a pause. I approached the hovering unit. It smelled of burnt insulation and rotting meat. The preservation fluids were failing again. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to know what was wrong. But I pulled the maintenance tool from my belt and pried open the access panel at the base of its skull. The heat radiating from the internal cogitator was intense. I bypassed the standard prayer seals and plugged my data slate directly into its logic core to run a diagnostic. I expected a mechanical jam or a corrupted vocal file. That was routine. That was safe. What scrolled across my green-hued screen was not routine. The error log flashed, rapidly scrolling through lines of binary garbage until it settled on a root directory path. The file that the servitor was trying to access, the source of its holy litanies, was flagged as corrupted. My eyes locked on the file name that the system had automatically tried to load as a backup. It wasn't labeled Sacred Tech Alpha. It wasn't labeled Divine Word. The glowing green text read, Load Subroutine Myth Construct v3.2. I blinked, sure that the fatigue was making me hallucinate. I queried the file properties. The creation date was millennia ago, but the metadata tags were chillingly clinical. Fabrication intended for population control. Threat mitigation. Pacification protocol. I felt a cold drop of sweat slide down my spine. The prayers were not recorded from saints. They were not divine transmissions. They were software. They were a construct designed to keep the masses quiet. I looked at the servitor, its dead glass eyes staring past me. It wasn't chanting because it believed. It was chanting because it was programmed to execute a subroutine named Myth. I closed the panel. My hands were shaking not from the vibration of the machine, but from a sudden hollow terror that opened up inside my chest. I rebooted the servitor. It twitched, the error cleared, and it resumed its mindless chanting. The Emperor endures. The Emperor protects. The sound was the same as it had been a minute ago, but to me, it had lost all resonance. It was tinny, artificial, false. I looked around the scriptorium at the thousands of souls pouring their lives into parchment, believing that their suffering purchased salvation. I walked back to my desk and picked up my quill. I dipped it in the ink. I wrote, "The Emperor protects." The letters looked the same, but the meaning had evaporated. The silence inside my head was deafening. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of an empty room where you expected to find a friend. Chapter 2. Numbers don't lie. There is no comfort in the mess hall, only the wet, rhythmic sound of 3,000 people chewing in unison. The air here is heavy, thick with the smell of recycled perspiration and the steaming vats of nutrient paste that serve as our fuel. We call it corpse starch in the darker corners of the barracks, though never where the overseers can hear. It is a gray, flavorless sludge that sits heavy in the stomach, designed to keep a body functioning just enough to hold a quill, but not enough to dream of rebellion. I stared at my metal tray, the dented surface reflecting a distorted image of my own face, gaunt, hollow-eyed gray as the food itself. I didn't eat. My appetite had vanished the moment I saw the code inside the servitor. Instead, I looked across the table at Father Tomas. He was the closest thing I had to a friend in this tomb, an old man whose spine had curved permanently into the shape of a question mark after 60 years of hunching over illuminated manuscripts. "You are not eating." Severin Thomas whispered, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like paper sliding over stone. He didn't look up from his own tray, his spoon moving with mechanical precision. I reached into the fold of my robe, my fingers brushing against the rough texture of the vellum scrap I had smuggled out of the archives earlier that week. It was dangerous to even possess it, but the question burned in my mind like a fever. I slid the scrap across the metal table, shielding it beneath my hand. Look at the dates, Father, I breathed, keeping my voice lower than the hum of the air recyclers. The text on the left is the Lectitio Divinitatus standard issue. The text on the right. I found it in a crate of uncatalogued salvage from the deep hives. It's dated 3,000 years prior. Thomas stopped chewing. He glanced at my hand, then at the numbers I had scribbled in the margins. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. The modern text claimed the emperor had always been divine, a god walking among men since the dawn of time. The salvage text, crumbling and faded, contained a direct quote from the Great Crusade, attributed to the emperor himself. Civilization will only triumph when the last stone of the last church falls upon the last priest. I watched Tomas's eyes widen. I saw the gears turning in his head, trying to reconcile the God we worshipped with the man who had seemingly outlawed that very worship. If he is a god, I whispered the words tasting like ash, why did he command us to stop praying? And if he isn't a god, then what have we been doing for 10,000 years? I expected a theological debate. I expected him to quote a counter-scripture to explain the metaphor to guide me back to the light. I wanted him to prove me wrong. I wanted him to tell me I was a fool so I could sleep at night. But he didn't. Father Thomas dropped his spoon. The clatter echoed loudly in the sudden silence between us. His face didn't show anger. It showed a terrified recognition. He snatched the vellum from under my hand and crumbled it into a ball, shoving it deep into his sleeve. Silence, he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting to the surveillance cherubs floating near the ceiling. Do not read what you are not meant to read, boy. Do not do the math. Just copy. Only copy. He stood up abruptly, his tray clattering to the floor, spilling the gray sludge across the metal grating. He walked away without looking back, his shoulders hunched tighter than before, as if the weight of the ceiling had suddenly doubled. I remained seated, my hand still resting on the cold table where the truth had been. I realized then that his fear wasn't the fear of a man confronting a lie. It was the fear of a man who already knew the truth and had spent a lifetime trying to forget it. I looked down at the spilled food, the gray puddle spreading slowly toward my boots. The numbers didn't lie. History was not a straight line. It was a circle of errors that we were forced to repeat. I picked up my spoon and took a bite of the tasteless paste. It felt like swallowing cement. The silence in my head was no longer empty. It was filling up with the cold, hard logic of betrayal. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Artifact. The restricted archives do not smell like ink. They smell of stagnant time. They smell of secrets that have been left to rot in the dark, fermenting into something poisonous. I shouldn't have been there. My clearance level was grade 4 scribe, barely enough to open a door in the upper hab blocks, let alone the sub-basement vaults, where the ecclesiarchy buried its mistakes. But I had the maintenance codes. I had stolen them from a dead tech adept 2 shifts ago, peeling the data wafer from his cold fingers before the reclamation servitors arrived to recycle his biomass. It was a crime punishable by immediate execution, but fear had been replaced by a hunger that gnawed at my insides. I needed to see the source code of our reality. The air in the vault was freezing. The ventilation systems down here had failed centuries ago, and the dust hung suspended in the air like a frozen gray fog. I moved through the rows of iron shelves, my lumen lamp casting long skeletal shadows against walls lined with data stacks. Every step crunched on the grit of the floor dust that I knew, with a sickening certainty, was mostly comprised of human skin flakes shed by archivists who had died down here alone. I found the terminal. I was looking for a cogitator engine from the M32 era. It was a beast of a machine, brass pipes and glass vacuum tubes protruding from its casing like exposed organs. I plugged in the stolen wafer. The machine groaned a deep, resonant vibration that I felt in my teeth. It wasn't happy to be woken up. The screen flickered to life, bathing my face in a harsh emerald glow. I didn't search for prayers. I searched for origins. I typed in the query that had been burning in my mind since the mess hall origin imperial cult. The machine processed for what felt like an eternity, the hard drive spinning with the sound of grinding stones. Then it spat out a file. Lectitio Divinitatus. I knew the name. It was the holy text, the bedrock of our faith, the book that taught us the Emperor was divine. But the metadata was wrong. The author wasn't a saint. It wasn't an unknown servant. The author field read Lorgar Aurelian. The name sent a shockwave of nausea through me. Lorgar, the arch-traitor, the demon prince, the man we were taught to hate above all others, the foundation of our entire religion, the very reason we suffered and toiled and died in the Emperor's name, was written by the same hand that had tried to destroy him. I should have stopped there. I should have purged the terminal and ran. But my finger hovered over a subfile attached to the text. It was an audio fragment, heavily corrupted, tagged Private Log Terra Siege. I pressed play. I expected a booming voice, a voice of thunder and gold, the voice of a god commanding the stars to align. I braced myself for the majesty that would surely blind me or burn my soul to ash. Static hissed through the speaker loud and sharp in the silence of the vault. Then a voice cut through the noise. It wasn't thunder. It was dry. It was tired. It sounded like an old man sitting in a chair he couldn't get out of. "I am not a god," the voice said, the words heavy with infinite exhaustion. I never was. Why do they insist on making me a monster? I only wanted to free them from the dark. And now they will worship the cage I built. The recording cut off with a snap. I stood frozen in the green light, my breath caught in my throat. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. Not a demon screaming, but a creator regretting his creation. The Emperor wasn't a god testing us. He was a failed father, horrified by what his children had become. A low hum behind me snapped me back to reality. The red lens of a servo skull drifted around the corner of the bookshelf, its anti-grav engine purring softly. It was scanning for intruders. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. I didn't have time to properly eject the wafer. I yanked it out, corrupting the session, and threw myself into the shadows beneath a desk, just as the skull's scanner swept the room. The red light washed over the empty chair where I had just been sitting. It lingered on the warm keys of the cogitator. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The skull hovered, processing, calculating, and then moved on, drifting deeper into the dark. I lay on the cold floor for a long time after it was gone. The silence of the archives returned, but it was different now. It felt heavier. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light anymore. It was the physical weight of the lie we were all living under. I had come looking for answers, and I had found the only thing worse than ignorance. I found out that the pilot of our ship had died 10,000 years ago, and we were just drifting through the void, worshipping his corpse. Chapter 4. The Empty Ritual. The Cathedral of the Sacred Heart does not welcome you. It crushes you. The ceiling is so high that storm clouds form indoors, trapped by the buttresses mixing with the oily smog of a million candles. Today, the air was thick enough to chew. We had been summoned for a high mass of abjuration. A minor warp storm was bleeding into the upper atmosphere of our world, turning the sky the color of bruised meat. The ecclesiarchy claimed it was a test of our resolve. I stood in the middle of the nave, a single gray drop in a sea of red robes and ragged tunics, surrounded by the deafening roar of 10,000 throats chanting for salvation. The sound was physical. It vibrated in the marrow of my bones, a desperate rhythmic thrum that sounded less like worship and more like panic, weaponized into song. Canoness Vespera stood at the high altar, her power armor gleaming in the candlelight, her voice amplified by vox casters until it sounded like the judgment of the earth itself. She screamed for penance, and the crowd screamed back, begging for a forgiveness that no one had the authority to grant. I watched the woman next to me. She was a manufacturing worker, her skin gray from years of breathing metal dust. She held a jagged piece of scrap metal in her hand, a shard of a broken cog. With every verse of the litany, she drove the metal into her own forearm. She wasn't wincing. She was weeping with joy. She believed that her pain was a currency that, if she paid enough blood, the Emperor would notice her. "See me," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "See my sacrifice." I looked at her arm, a ruin of unnecessary wounds, and felt a cold numbness spreading through my chest. 2 days ago, I might have seen this as piety. Now I saw it for what it was, a transaction with a void. She was buying insurance from a bankrupt company. I wanted to grab her hand to stop the bleeding, to shake her, and scream that the man on the golden throne was too tired to care about her arm. But I didn't. I just stood there, mouthing the words a ghost in the machine. I looked up at the statue of the Emperor that dominated the apse. It was 100 meters of gold and marble depicting him as a warrior god with a halo of lightning. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. And it was a lie. I remembered the voice from the recording, the dry human rasp of a man who just wanted to be left alone. I looked at the statue's eyes. They were blank stone. There was no consciousness behind them, no divine presence watching the storm. The connection was dead. We were shouting into a disconnected Vox line waiting for an operator who had left the building 10 millennia ago. "He doesn't hear us," I whispered the words lost in the avalanche of noise. "He isn't even looking." Then the miracle happened, or so they called it. The Vox casters announced that the warp storm had dissipated. A roar of triumph erupted from the crowd, a sound so intense it threatened to crack the stained glass. People fell to their knees, weeping, hugging each other, praising Vespera's strength and the Emperor's mercy. The woman beside me collapsed, sobbing in gratitude, blood pooling around her knees. "He saved us," she choked out. "He accepted the offering." I pulled my small atmospherics gauge from my belt, a tool for monitoring library humidity, nothing more. I looked at the readings. The barometric pressure had normalized 3 hours ago. The ionization levels had dropped due to a natural shift in the planet's magnetic field. The storm had broken because that is what weather does. It changes. It had nothing to do with the blood on the floor. It had nothing to do with the prayers. It was physics, indifferent and cold. I looked at the weeping woman, then at the gauge. It wasn't mercy. It was just weather. But try telling that to someone who has already paid for the miracle with their own flesh. Chapter 5, Ghost of Reason. My HAB unit is a coffin of poured concrete, barely large enough to contain a cot, a bucket, and the suffocating weight of my own thoughts. The air is always stale here, recycled through filters that haven't been changed since the age of apostasy, smelling faintly of old sweat and copper wiring. I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the hairline cracks in the ceiling, unable to close my eyes. The logic was eating me alive. I kept replaying the events at the cathedral, the woman's blood, the storm clearing the readings on my gauge. If the Emperor is just a man, just a corpse on a chair, then why did the warp storm break? Was it truly just weather? Or is there a power in the collective belief of billions, a psychic scream so loud it forces reality to bend, regardless of whether the God listening is real or not? I felt like a man trying to solve a quadratic equation, while the building around him burned down. I was looking for variables in a universe that only offered madness. When sleep finally took me, it didn't bring rest. It brought the void. I didn't dream of demons with too many teeth or rivers of blood. Those are the nightmares of the faithful, the fears given to us by the ecclesiarchy to keep us obedient. My nightmare was far worse. I dreamt of silence. I floated in an infinite cold blackness where no stars shone. There was no golden throne anchoring the galaxy. There was no Astronomican guiding ships through the night. There was just nothing. No purpose, no plan, no hatred and no love. Just the endless, indifferent drift of atoms cooling in the dark. I woke up, gasping, my skin clammy and cold, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The terror wasn't that the demons were coming for me. The terror was that there was no one coming to save me. I was alone in a room of stone on a planet of rock, spinning in a galaxy that didn't know my name. Morning brought the gray light of the artificial cycle and a ration bar wrapped in foil. I sat on the edge of my cot, the brick of processed nutrient heavy in my hand. Custom dictates that one must recite the grace of the provider before the first bite. By his will, we are fed. By his strength, we endure. I had said it every morning for 30 years. It was as automatic as breathing. But today I stopped. I held the bar. I looked at the surveillance slate on the wall, a dull, unblinking eye of glass. I decided to test the mechanism of judgment. I placed the food on my knee and sat in absolute stillness. I did not make the sign of the Aquila. I did not whisper the words. I mentally blasphemed, challenging the lightning to strike, daring the floor to open up and swallow the heretic. I waited for the pain. I waited for the sudden seizure of a heart stopped by divine wrath. Nothing happened. The ventilation fan kept rattling its broken rhythm. The dust motes danced in the pale light undisturbed. The ration bar did not turn to ash in my mouth. It tasted of the same bland starch and chemical preservatives. It always did. I chewed slowly, swallowing the dryness with difficulty. There was no thunder. There was no divine intervention. I had broken a sacred law, and the universe had greeted my rebellion with a shrug. A terrible realization settled over me, heavier than any punishment could have been. If I had been struck down, it would have proven that he was watching. It would have proven that I mattered enough to be judged. But the silence was absolute. I finished the meal in the quiet dark of my room. The silence of the universe is far more terrifying than its anger, because anger implies presence. Silence just means you are talking to yourself. Chapter 6. The Art of Pretense. The Schola Progenium is not a school. It is a factory, designed to hammer the soft clay of childhood into the hard, brittle bricks of the Imperium. I was assigned to the dawn rotation, teaching the litany of unquestioning service to a class of 6-year-olds. They sat in perfect rows, their heads shaven, their small bodies swallowed by rough-spun tunics that were 2 sizes too big. They looked like miniature ghosts, their eyes wide and terrified, tracking my every movement as I paced the cold stone floor. I held a rod of plasteel in my hand, a correction stick, the abbess called it. It was heavy-weighted with lead at the tip. I hated the weight of it. It felt like holding a lie made solid. Again, I commanded my voice flat and authoritative. Verse 4. Louder. The Emperor cannot hear whispers. The children took a collective breath, a tiny gasp of air in the stale room, and began to scream the words. Blessed is the mind too small for doubt. Blessed is the hand that does not hesitate. In the 3rd row, a boy stopped. He was small, with a smear of ink on his cheek, and eyes that were too bright, too intelligent for a world that demanded blindness. His name was Davian. He didn't stutter. He simply stopped chanting and frowned at the text in front of him. In the scriptorium, a pause is a mistake. In the schola, a pause is heresy. The silence from his desk spread outward like a contagion until the other children trailed off, looking from him to me with fearful anticipation. I stopped pacing. I walked to his desk, the click of my boots sounding like gunshots in the quiet. "Why have you ceased your praise, novitiate?" I asked, keeping my face a mask of stone. I saw myself in him. I saw the same dangerous curiosity that had led me to the restricted archives. Davian looked up at me. He didn't look afraid, not yet. He looked confused. "Magos," he piped up, his voice high and clear. "The verse says the Emperor's light reaches every corner of the galaxy. It says his gaze is inescapable." He pointed a small, dirty finger at the corner of the room, where the shadows gathered thick and heavy. "But if he is everywhere, why do we need the lumen globes? If his light is real, why is it so dark in here?" It was a logical question. It was a beautiful question. It was the kind of question that gets a man burned at the stake before he reaches the age of 20. My heart hammered against my ribs. If I answered him with logic, if I validated his doubt, the monitoring servitors would record it. The Inquisition would come, not just for me, but for him. They would take this bright, inquisitive child and turn him into a lobotomized cherub to float forever in the dark, humming static. I tightened my grip on the plasteel rod. I knew what I had to do. I had to kill the question to save the boy. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't afford to. I raised the rod and brought it down hard on the desk, inches from his hand. The crack was deafening. Davian jumped, his eyes widening in sudden, absolute terror. "Heresy!" I shouted, injecting a venom into my voice that I didn't feel. "You dare question the mechanics of the divine. You dare use your primitive logic to measure the God Emperor." I struck the desk again, harder, splintering the wood. "Darkness exists only because your faith is weak. It is your failure, not his." The boy began to cry, shrinking away from me, curling into a ball to protect himself. I saw the light of curiosity die in his eyes, replaced by the dull animal glaze of survival. It broke my heart, but I kept shouting. I lectured him on the sin of intellect, on the virtue of blind acceptance. I made him recite the apology until his voice was raw. When the bell finally rang, the children filed out in silence, terrified of the world, terrified of their own thoughts. I stood alone in the empty classroom, my hand trembling as I gripped the rod. I had saved his life. I had crushed his spirit to keep his heart beating. I looked at the weapon in my hand and realized with a sick familiarity that I was no longer just an observer of the machine. I was a gear, and I was turning perfectly. Chapter 7. Gears of Blood. My promotion was not a reward. It was a relocation to a louder circle of hell. I was reassigned to Manufactorum Theta 9 as a line overseer, tasked with supervising the production of saintly wards. These were not the relic bones of martyrs encased in gold. They were mass-produced discs of cheap gray recycling plastic, stamped with a blurred image of the Aquila. The air in the factory was unbreathable, a toxic soup of melting polymers and unwashed bodies. The noise was a physical assault, the rhythmic thump-hiss of the hydraulic presses hitting the conveyor belt every 2 seconds. Thump-hiss. Thump-hiss. With every cycle, another 100 holy amulets were born, destined to be sold to the starving masses in the underhive for a week's worth of ration coupons. I stood on the gantry watching the workers below. They were barely human anymore, just flesh extensions of the press, their hands moving with a suicidal speed to clear the jams before the stamp came down again. I knew the specifications of these amulets. I had seen the material sheets. They offered 0 ballistic protection. They contained no micro-shield generators. They were scrap plastic. but the ecclesiarchy claimed that faith imbued them with the power to turn a bolter shell. I was supervising the industrial manufacturing of hope, and the raw material was lies. The accident happened during the 14th hour of the shift. Fatigue is the true enemy of the manufactorum, not heresy. A worker named Jared, a man whose skin was stained permanently gray by the plastic fumes, misjudged the rhythm. He reached in to dislodge a stuck sheet of polymer just as the hydraulic piston fired. There was no scream, just a wet, crunching sound that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the machines. The press didn't stop. It wasn't designed to stop for meat. It retracted with a hiss, revealing a mangled ruin of bone and machinery. The alarm finally blared a harsh klaxon that cut through the din. I ran down the metal stairs, my boots slipping on the oil and blood that was already spreading across the grate. By the time I reached him, Jared was already fading. His chest was crushed, his breathing a bubbling rattle of red froth. I knelt beside him, not to save him. There is no saving a man when the machine has claimed him, but to offer the last rites. That was my job now, to lie to the dying. Jared's eyes were wide, frantic, darting around the ceiling as if looking for the angels that were promised in the pamphlets. His good hand was clenched tight around something. I looked down. He was gripping one of the amulets, the very thing that had just killed him. It was warm from the press, a piece of cheap plastic still smoking slightly. I have it. He wheezed, blood spilling over his lips. The Emperor. He protects. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for confirmation. He was dying in agony, crushed by the indifference of industry, but he was smiling. He truly believed that this piece of garbage in his hand was a ticket to the golden throne. I froze. The truth was sitting on the tip of my tongue, bitter and acid. I wanted to tell him that the amulet was worthless. I wanted to tell him he died for nothing, that the machine didn't care that the Emperor wasn't watching. I wanted to scream that he had traded his life for a lie. But I looked at the peace settling over his face. The pain was washing away, replaced by a drug more potent than any narcotic certainty. If I told him the truth, now I would be stealing his only comfort. I would be sending him into the void, terrified and alone. So I swallowed the bile in my throat. I reached out and closed his fingers tighter around the plastic disc. Yes, Jared, I lied, my voice steady and cold. He sees you. The amulet is strong. You are safe. He let out a long, rattling breath, and then he was gone. I stood up, wiping his blood onto my robes. It was trash to me, a meaningless token of superstition. But to him, it was morphine. And who was I to deny a dying man his painkiller? Chapter 8. The Minor Purge. Fear has a specific sound in the Imperium. It isn't screaming. Screaming happens when the fear is realized. True fear is silence. It is the absolute suffocating quiet that falls over a room of 500 workers when the heavy iron doors grind open. Canoness Vespera had arrived for a purity audit. She didn't come with an army. She didn't need one. She walked through the manufactorum floor with 2 battle sisters flanking her, their power armor humming with a lethal subsonic vibration. But it was Vespera's boots that I remember. They were heavy reinforced ceramite, and every step she took sounded like a judge's gavel striking a death sentence. Clack, clack, clack. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the bowed heads of the workforce, looking not for inefficiency, but for doubt. We stood in formation, eyes fixed on the floor, breathing shallowly, praying that we were invisible. To be noticed by the ecclesiarchy is to be dissected. They didn't stop at the workers. They moved to the administrative platform where the scribes and minor priests stood. They stopped in front of Father Thomas. My stomach turned to ice. Thomas, the old man who had eaten his nutrient paste in silence since that day in the mess hall, looked small and fragile in his stained robes. One of the battle sisters stepped forward holding a data slate. She read the charge in a bored, monotone voice, utterance of unauthorized historical timelines, possession of non-sanctioned arithmetic logic, suspicion of moral deviation. It was such a small thing. He hadn't shouted death to the Emperor. He had probably just mumbled about the dates again, his senile mind slipping back to the numbers that didn't add up. But in the eyes of the canoness, a slip of the tongue was a slip of the soul. Two servitors moved in, grabbing the old man by his frail arms. He didn't fight. He just looked confused, blinking behind his thick spectacles. Vespera turned her head. Her gaze didn't sweep over the crowd this time. It locked directly onto me. She knew we shared a table. She knew we spoke. She was testing the contagion. The air between us felt like it had been stripped of oxygen. "You knew him," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation waiting for a trigger. "Did you hear his heresy? Did you taste the rot in his words?" The servitors paused, holding Thomas suspended between them. He looked at me. For a second there was a spark of recognition in his eyes, a silent plea from one human being to another. "Help me. If I defended him, I would join him. If I pleaded for mercy, I would be branded a sympathizer." The equation was simple. Survival required a sacrifice. I didn't tremble. I didn't look at Thomas. I looked straight into Vespera's cold, hard eyes and killed the part of my soul that remembered his friendship. "He is old canoness," I said, my voice steady and indifferent. "His mind is like a cog with broken teeth. He slips. He babbles. There is no heresy here, only the waste product of a failing biological unit." It was the cruelest thing I could have said. I stripped him of his dignity to save my own skin. I called my friend a broken machine. Vespera stared at me for a long beat, searching for a crack in my mask. Finding none, she nodded once. "Process him for servitor conversion. His mind is useless, but his hands can still serve." They dragged him away. He didn't scream. He just sagged the fight, leaving him as he realized I had condemned him. The doors hissed shut behind them, cutting off the sight of his dragging feet. The silence returned to the manufactorum, but it was different now. It was the silence of accomplices. Vespera moved on, satisfied with the efficiency of the purge. I stood there staring at the empty space where Thomas had been. I was alive. My heart was beating. But as I listened to the fading sound of Vespera's boots, I realized that I had just passed the final test. I wasn't a victim of the system anymore. I was one of its operators. I had sold a man for the privilege of continuing to breathe the stale air. Chapter 9. The Crack in Reality. The Underhive does not follow the laws of physics. It follows the laws of desperation. I was attached to Purge Team Epsilon 4, not as a soldier, but as a scribe. My duty was to record the spiritual containment of a localized disturbance in the black market sector. The air down here was heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. It smelled of ozone and wet dog, the distinct metallic scent of the warp bleeding into real space. We cornered the source of the disturbance in a rag seller's stall. It wasn't a monster. It was a boy, no older than 16, hovering 3 feet off the ground. His eyes were burning with a witch light that cast no shadows, and he was screaming. He wasn't screaming in pain. He was screaming in tongues, vomiting out truths that the human mind is not built to process. He spoke of the great devourer of the laughing god, of the geometries of madness waiting behind the veil. The deacon leading our squad stepped forward. He was a man of absolute, unshakable faith, clad in robes of embroidered silk. He held his golden aquila high like a lantern in the dark. "Abomination," he bellowed, his voice confident, practiced. "The Emperor commands you to cease. The light of Terra burns away the shadow. The squad joined him in the litany of banishing. It was a powerful sight. In the holovids, this is the moment the demon shrieks and dissolves. In the holovids, the symbol of the Emperor is an impenetrable shield. I watched Pen hovering over my slate, waiting for the victory. But the boy didn't dissolve. He looked at the deacon and he laughed. It was a sound like tearing metal. With a mere twitch of his mind, the boy reached out. The deacon didn't even have time to scream. The golden aquila, the holy symbol that was supposed to protect him, melted in his hand, fusing with his flesh in a horrific display of heat and agony. Then, an invisible force picked the deacon up and twisted him like a wet rag. Bones snapped with the sound of dry kindling. The squad fired their laser guns, but the beams refracted harmlessly around the boy's psychic shield. The prayers turned to screams. The faith that was supposed to be their armor was nothing more than paper against a hurricane. I stood frozen in the chaos. I saw the truth that the ecclesiarchy burned worlds to hide the warp doesn't care about your piety. It doesn't care about your badges or your books. It is raw, predatory energy. I looked at the devastation at the soldiers dying while shouting the Emperor's name. I looked at the boy who was now preparing to unleash a wave of force that would level the entire market. I didn't pray. I didn't hold up a symbol. I dropped my data slate and grabbed the stub revolver from the holster of a fallen enforcer. It was a heavy, ugly, solid piece of metal. It wasn't holy. It was just a machine that threw lead at high velocity. I aimed. I didn't aim with my soul. I aimed with my eye. I squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked in my hand, a brutal physical recoil. The bullet punched through the psychic field, not because it was blessed, but because it was fast. It took the boy in the forehead. The witch light vanished instantly. The boy dropped to the ground, just a dead kid with a hole in his head. The warp pressure evaporated. The silence that followed was heavy with the smell of cordite and burnt meat. I looked at the smoking gun in my hand, then at the mangled body of the deacon. Faith had failed. The holy symbol had melted. But the bullet had done exactly what it was designed to do. Physics had won. Chapter 10. Diamond in the Machine. The corruption didn't die with the boy. It seeped into the copper cabling and fiber optics traveling at the speed of light to the heart of the district of the primary generatorum. When I arrived, the air in the vault tasted of burnt copper and ozone, a sharp electric tang that made my teeth ache. This wasn't a room for humans. It was a cathedral of turbines, a space dominated by the deafening roar of the Omnissiah's breath. But the rhythm was wrong. The steady thrum of the generators had been replaced by a discordant shrieking, the sound of metal grinding against metal in a way that sounded uncomfortably like weeping. In the center of the room, the main cogitator bank was convulsing. Cables were lashing out like vipers, and the screens were bleeding code, not green text, but red fractious runes that hurt the eyes to look at. A scrap code demon was birthing itself from the hardware, a monstrosity of junk data and hatred given form. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus were already there surrounding the abominable machine in a circle of red robes. They were terrified. I could see it in the frantic twitching of their mechadendrites, hear it in the high-pitched speed of their binary cant. They were chanting the litany of pacification, swinging censers of heavy oils, begging the machine spirit to calm down. They droned a digital plea for mercy. But the demon wasn't being pacified. It was feeding. I watched as the entity, a swirling vortex of electricity and jagged metal, seemed to inhale their fear. The more they treated it like an angry god, the more godlike it became. It grew larger, arcing lightning that vaporized a junior engineer where he stood. His cybernetics fused instantly, and his scream was cut short by a burst of superheated steam. They were pouring gasoline on a fire, believing it was holy water. I stood in the shadow of a cooling tower watching the massacre. It was a closed loop of insanity. Their belief that the machine had a soul was giving the demon a soul to eat. To stop it, I had to stop treating it like a supernatural event. I had to treat it like a malfunction. I holstered my weapon. Bullets wouldn't work on a cloud of electricity. I needed physics. I needed to cut the food supply. The emergency shutoff levers were located on the far wall behind a grate, marked with warnings of extreme tech heresy. To pull that lever was to kill the machine spirit, a sin punishable by lobotomy. The priests would rather die than commit deicide against their engine. But I had already killed a man today. What was a generator? I moved. I didn't run with the fervor of a hero. I walked with the efficiency of a technician. I ignored the lightning arcing over my head. I ignored the screaming binary of the dying priests. I reached the control panel and smashed the glass casing with the butt of my pistol. The alarm that blared was physical mechanical. Real. I grabbed the heavy iron lever. It was cold. It didn't vibrate with spiritual energy. It was just a piece of metal connected to a circuit breaker. I didn't pray. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I yanked the lever down with both hands. Clunk. The sound was heavy and final. The effect was instantaneous. The lights in the cavern died. The screaming turbines spun down into a low, dying moan. The red lightning flickered and vanished as the electromagnetic field collapsed. The demon, deprived of its energy source, didn't roar or curse. It simply ceased to exist, dissipating like smoke in a breeze. There was no magic left, only the ticking of cooling metal and the smell of fried insulation. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood in the dark, my hand still on the lever. The tech priests stopped their chanting, their red eye lenses glowing in the gloom, staring at me in horror. I had saved them. I had banished the demon. But looking at their faces, I knew I hadn't performed a miracle. I had committed a murder. I had killed their god to save their lives. Chapter 11. The Hero's Sentence. I sat in the interrogation chamber for 3 hours before Canoness Vespera arrived. It was not a dungeon. It was a pristine white room with a single metal table and a light so bright it felt like it was bleaching the color from my irises. My hands were still covered in the grease of the generator and the dried blood of the boy from the market. I was exhausted, my body aching from the recoil of the pistol and the adrenaline crash, but there was a small, foolish ember of pride burning in my chest. I had saved the district. The generator was spinning up again. The demon was gone. I had acted when the priests had frozen. In any sane universe, this is where the soldier receives a medal. But as the door hissed open and Vespera stepped in, stripping off her armored gauntlets with slow, deliberate movements, I remembered that sanity is a commodity we ran out of long ago. She didn't sit. She stood over me, smelling of incense and cold iron. Her face a mask of disappointment so profound it felt like a physical weight. I started to speak, to give my report, to explain the tactical necessity of the hard reset. The machine spirit was corrupted. I began, my voice raspy. I had to sever the connection to save the blow came out of nowhere. The back of her hand reinforced with ceramite knuckles connected with my jaw. It wasn't a slap of passion. It was a corrective measure, precise and brutal. I tasted copper as my head snapped back, the room spinning. I spat blood onto the pristine white floor. Vespera didn't raise her voice. She spoke in a whisper that was far more terrifying than a scream. "You used a gun," she said. "You used a lever. You treated the manifest anger of the archenemy as a technical fault. You saved their bodies, Severin. I grant you that. The generator turns. The lights are on. But you have damned them." She walked around the table, her shadow falling over me. "Do you think the Emperor cares about electricity?" she asked. "Do you think he cares if the manufacturer meets its quota today? He cares for their souls." Those priests were chanting. They were dying with his name on their lips. They were being purified by their martyrdom. By intervening with your soulless logic, you robbed them of a holy death. You taught them that a switch is more powerful than a prayer. She leaned in close, her eyes burning with a terrifying conviction. "It is better for 1 billion people to die in the dark with faith than to live in the light without it. You are not a hero, archivist. You are a contagion. You are the proof that effectiveness is the enemy of holiness." I didn't argue. I couldn't. In her eyes, I saw the unshakable bedrock of the Imperium. It didn't matter that I was right. It didn't matter that the demon was gone. The result was irrelevant. The process was God. I had broken the narrative. I had proven that the universe was mechanical, not moral, and that was a crime worse than murder. She signaled to the guards waiting outside. "Throw him in the oubliette," she commanded, wiping a speck of my blood from her glove. "Let him rot in the dark. He loves so much until we decide how to burn him." As they dragged me away, I didn't struggle. I let them take me. The cell would be cold and damp, but at least there, in the absolute darkness, I wouldn't have to look at the lie anymore. I had saved the city, and my reward was the truth. In this world, competence is the ultimate heresy. Chapter 12. Whispers in the Dark. The oubliette is not a place, it is a duration. It is a hole in the rock where time goes to die. There is no light, no sound, and no sensation other than the gnawing damp and the sharp, twisting cramps of an empty stomach. I do not know how long I was down there. These weeks. In the dark, the mind begins to eat itself to stay alive. I sat in the muck, shivering, listening to the beat of my own heart. It was the only clock I had left. But after a while, I wasn't alone anymore. The darkness began to speak. It didn't scream like the boy in the market. It didn't roar like the generator. It whispered. And the most terrifying thing about the voice was that it sounded exactly like me. It sounded like my own internal monologue, but sharper, clearer, liberated from the fear of consequences. "You know," the voice murmured, sliding through the silence like oil on water. "They put you here because you were right. That is the great joke, isn't it, Severin? You fixed their machine. You saved their lives. And they threw you in a hole because you didn't say the magic words." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was vibrating in the bones of my skull. Why protect them? It continued, reasonable and calm. Why starve in the dark? For a regime that worships a corpse, I can show you the real patterns. I can show you the geometry of the warp. No more lies, no more quotas. Just pure, unadulterated power. You want the truth? I am the truth. It was the seduction of logic. That is how the arch-enemy truly works. They don't tempt you with spikes and blood. They tempt you with the one thing you desire most. For the fanatic, they offer a God who actually answers. For the soldier, they offer a war that never ends. For me, for the man who hated lies, they offered clarity. I saw it in my mind's eye, a universe of infinite possibility, where laws could be rewritten, where gravity was a suggestion, where I never had to bow to a statue again. I felt the walls of the cell dissolving. I could just step out. All I had to do was agree. All I had to do was admit that the Imperium was a hollow shell, and that chaos was the only vitality left in a dying galaxy. I sat there trembling, the taste of freedom sweet and metallic on my tongue. I opened my mouth to say yes, to say anything. But then I remembered the boy in the market. I remembered the deacon twisted like a wet rag. That wasn't freedom. That was biology unraveled. That was the end of meaning. I realized then that I didn't hate the lie of the Emperor because it was false. I hated it because it was cruel. But the warp wasn't cruel. It was indifferent. It was cancer. And between a cruel father and a cancerous tumor, you choose the father. No, I croaked, my voice sounding like grinding stones. The Emperor is a corpse. His church is a lie. But it is our lie. It is human. You are just the noise between the stations. The whisper turned into a hiss of disappointment, but before the darkness could retaliate, the world ended. A massive concussion shook the foundations of the prison. Dust rained down on me in the dark. Then another impact, closer this time, followed by the muffled thump, thump, thump of heavy bolter fire from the levels above. The oubliette shook violently, and the heavy iron seal of the ceiling cracked. A beam of light, red, angry, and flickering, sliced through the darkness. The alarms were blaring, distant and panicked. The whispers in my head vanished, drowned out by the very real, very loud sound of a city under siege. The lock on the hatch shattered, blown inward by an explosion that smelled of promethium. I wasn't being released. I was being unearthed. The war had come to the prison, and for the first time in days, I stood up. I was weak, starving, and unarmed, but my mind was my own. I had stared into the abyss, and I had chosen the cage. Chapter 13. Race to the bell tower. I climbed out of the grave and into the inferno. The oubliette had preserved me in cold silence, but the world above had turned into a furnace. The scriptorium, the place where I had spent 30 years documenting the slow decay of the Imperium, was now accelerating the process at a terrifying speed. The air was thick with a snowstorm of gray ash, the cremated remains of billions of prayers. The great shelves of vellum were burning, turning centuries of holy laws into fuel for the fire. Through the smoke, I saw the slaughter. The cultists had breached the main gates. They were not the organized soldiers of the Imperial Guard. They were a rabble of madmen, their skin carved with 8-pointed stars, their weapons a mishmash of stolen autoguns and industrial tools. They were butchering the scribes. And the scribes were dying exactly as they had lived. They were on their knees. I saw men I had known for decades, men who could recite the lineage of saints from memory, refusing to run. They held their quills like daggers, chanting litanies of shielding as chain axes split their skulls. They died, waiting for a force field that was never going to activate. I didn't run towards the exit. The exits were choked with pileups of bodies. I ran up. I scrambled up the maintenance ladders, my emaciated limbs burning with exertion, aiming for the central spire, the Vox Tower. If there was any hope of coordinating a defense, or at least dying with a purpose, it was in the communication array. The heat was blistering. My robes were ragged and soaked in the filth of the prison, making me look more like one of the attackers than a priest. I reached the landing of the bell tower, gasping for air, my lungs filling with the taste of burning ink. And there I found her. Canoness Vespera, the woman who had thrown me in a hole for saving the city, was slumped against the base of a marble pillar. Her power armor was cracked, the white ceramite stained with soot and arterial red. Her bolter lay on the floor just out of reach. She wasn't dead. She was broken. Her eyes, usually so full of icy judgment, were wide and vacant, staring at the carnage below. She was muttering her lips, moving in a frantic, silent loop. I leaned in close, expecting a final command, a curse, a prayer. Why, she whispered, her voice a shattered thing. I called to him. I offered them. I offered them all. Why is the fire still burning? She had finally hit the wall I had hit years ago. She had done everything right. The rituals, the sacrifices. The purging of heretics like me and the enemy was still winning. The logic of her faith had snapped under the weight of reality. She was paralyzed, not by the wound in her side, but by the silence of her God. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a cold, pragmatic urgency. I grabbed the front of her breastplate and hauled her up her weight, heavy and dead in my arms. She looked at me blinking, trying to reconcile the heretic with the Savior. "He isn't coming," I hissed into her ear, my voice cutting through the roar of the flames. "The angels are not coming, Vespera. The fire burns, because that is what fire does." I kicked her bolter across the floor until it hit her boot. "Stop asking him to save you. Save yourself." She looked at the gun, then at me. The vacancy in her eyes hardened into something else, not faith, but hate. Hate is good. Hate keeps you moving when hope is dead. She picked up the weapon. I didn't need her to believe. I just needed her to aim. Chapter 14. The Great Lie. The Vox Tower was not a fortress. It was a coffin with a view. The heavy blast doors were already glowing cherry red in the center, the metal groaning under the assault of thermal lances and chain blades from the other side. Inside the control room was a wall of screens, a mosaic of disaster. I looked at the grainy green footage being fed from the lower levels. It was a rout. The PDF troopers weren't being overrun because they were outgunned. They were being overrun because they were broken. I saw men dropping their laser guns to cover their ears. I saw squads huddled in prayer circles waiting to be butchered, begging for a salvation that I knew with absolute mathematical certainty was never coming. They were dying of despair. They had looked into the face of the warp and found their own faith wanting. I stood before the primary broadcast console. The microphone was a heavy brass instrument, shaped like a skull, cold to the touch. It was connected to the Hive's public address system, a network of speakers that reached every hab block, every factory floor, and every trench. This was it. This was the moment I had dreamed of in the dark of my cell. I had the ear of the city. I could finally tell them the truth. I could whisper into this machine and tell them that the Emperor was a corpse, that the ecclesiarchy was a fraud, and that we were all alone in the dark. I could liberate them from the lie before the end. I reached for the activation rune, my hand trembling. Truth. It was the only thing I had ever valued. But then my eyes flicked back to the screen. I saw a young trooper no older than the boy I had killed in the market looking up at the sky with tears streaming down his face, his weapon forgotten in the mud. He was ready to die, not because he was weak, but because he felt abandoned. If I told him the truth now, if I told him he was alone, he would just lie down and let the monsters take him. The truth was a poison. It was a cold, hard knife that would cut the last strings holding these people together. I looked at Vespera, who was reloading her bolter with one hand, her face a mask of grim determination. She knew the lie, and yet she fought. She fought because of the lie. I realized then that I had a choice. I could be right or I could be useful. I could die a martyr to the truth and watch my city burn, or I could become the very thing I despised to give them a fighting chance. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat. I didn't pray. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I slammed my hand down on the activation rune. The on-air light bathed the room in a blood-red glow. I didn't speak with my own voice. I dug deep into my memories, channeling the thunderous, fanatical baritone of every high priest I had ever hated. I became the mask. Brothers, sisters, I roared into the mic, the feedback whining like a dying soul. Look up, do not despair on the screens. I saw heads snap up. The soldiers froze. You think he has abandoned you? You think the Emperor does not see? I leaned into the lie, pouring every ounce of my rage and fear into the deception. I see him, the golden throne shines upon this hive. He is walking amongst us, I see his lightning in your guns. I feel his wrath in your hearts. I watched the monitors. The young trooper wiped his face. He picked up his rifle. He demands their blood. He demands their skulls fight. Fight for him, and you shall live forever. I cut the feed. The silence in the room was instant, but on the screens, the world had changed. The soldiers were screaming now, not in fear, but in a frenzy. They were charging the cultists, throwing themselves into the fire with a suicidal joy, convinced that a god was marching with them. I stepped back from the console, my chest heaving. I had saved them. I had turned the tide. And I had done it by speaking the greatest heresy of all I had spoken for God, and I had lied. Before we witness the cost of this victory, if you have ever had to compromise your soul to save something you loved, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next, the silence after the screaming stops, is the part of the story they never put in the history books. Chapter 15. The Cost of Victory. The silence that follows a battle is not peaceful. It is heavy. It presses down on your eardrums, filled with the phantom echoes of screams that have only just stopped. I walked through the main plaza of the hive, the ground paved with a slush of ash, spent shell casings, and the twisted remains of the cultists. The air was still thick with the smell of cooked meat and promethium, a sweet, cloying scent that coated the back of my throat. We had won. The miracle I had broadcast had worked. The sheer manic ferocity of the counterattack had broken the enemy's spine. I saw PDF troopers, men who had been weeping in terror, an hour ago now, walking among the dead with the swagger of immortals. They touched their Aquila pendants. They pointed to the sky. They believed they had been possessed by the divine. They didn't know they had just been possessed by adrenaline and a lie. I found Canoness Vespera near the burnt-out husk of a chimera transport. She was alive, though her armor was a ruin of scorched ceramite. She was overseeing the execution of the surviving heretics. A line of prisoners knelt in the mud. Blam, blam, blam. The bolter shots were rhythmic, efficient, mechanical. She stopped when she saw me. For the first time since I had known her, she didn't look at me with contempt. She didn't look at me with superiority. She looked at me with something far colder fear. She had heard my broadcast. She knew I didn't believe a word of it. She had seen a man strip God of his divinity and use the carcass as a blunt instrument to bludgeon an army to death. "You have a silver tongue, Archivist," she said quietly, holstering her weapon. Her voice was devoid of its usual fire. I felt the morale shift. It was unnatural. You spoke with his voice, but there was no light behind it. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so the nearby soldiers wouldn't hear. A true believer would have hesitated. A true believer would have feared misinterpreting his will. You didn't hesitate. You lied with the perfection of a demon. She paused, looking at the soldiers who were now noticing me, starting to gather their eyes wide with reverence. I should burn you for blasphemy, but I cannot burn the savior of the hive. That is your punishment, Severin. You have to live with them. She walked away, leaving me surrounded. The soldiers didn't see a tired scribe. They saw the voice of the Emperor. A young sergeant fell to his knees, grabbing the hem of my filth-stained robe. "Bless you, Father," he sobbed, smearing blood and ash onto the fabric. "I heard him because of you. I heard him." Others joined in a circle of desperate, battered souls, reaching out to touch me, to steal a fragment of the holiness they thought I possessed. I looked down at them. I felt a wave of nausea so potent I almost vomited. I wanted to push them away. I wanted to scream that I was a fraud. But I didn't. I placed a hand on the sergeant's head. I let them worship the lie. It was the only thing holding them together. Chapter 16. Gatekeeper of the Void. They gave me the red robes. They gave me the high collar of the ecclesiarchy and a balcony overlooking the city I had saved. I am no longer Archivist Severin, the man who copies texts in the dark. I am High Preacher Severin, the hero of Hive Primus, the voice of the Golden Throne. From up here, the people look like ants. The smog of the manufactorums has returned, wrapping the city in its comforting toxic blanket. The machinery of the Imperium is turning again, fueled by the blood of the fallen and the sweat of the survivors. I stand on the balcony every evening, and I look up at the sky. I look for the light of the Astronomicon. I look for the face of God in the stars. But I still see what I saw in the cell. I see the void. I see the cold, indifferent math of a universe that does not care if we live or die. And yet I understand now. The truth is too heavy for the human spine to bear. If I were to tell them what I know, that the Emperor is a corpse, that the prayers are just software, that we are alone, the city would collapse faster than any chaos invasion could destroy it. They need the lie. The lie is the mortar that holds the bricks of civilization together. It is the only thing standing between humanity and the screaming madness of the warp. I have become the thing I hated. I am the gatekeeper. I stand at the door of the truth, holding it shut with all my strength, not to protect the secrets from the people, but to protect the people from the nothingness. A stirring sermon you gave at the induction ceremony today, a voice said from the shadows behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. The air had grown cold, and the smell of ozone and old parchment signaled the arrival of someone far more dangerous than a canoness. A figure stepped into the light, a man in a long leather coat, a rosette of the Holy Inquisition pinned to his chest. He didn't look like a warrior. He looked like a surgeon. But we both know you didn't mean a word of it. He continued, leaning against the railing next to me. I've read your file, Severin. I've seen the logs from the restricted archives. You know, you've seen the cracks in the wall. I gripped the railing, my knuckles turning white. Are you here to burn me, Inquisitor? I asked, my voice flat. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Burn you? Why would I burn the most effective tool in this sector? A fanatic is predictable, Severin. A fanatic breaks when his God doesn't answer. But you don't need God to answer. You answered for him. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt like a shackle snapping shut. The Imperium doesn't need more believers. We have trillions of those. We need men who can look into the abyss, see that it is empty, and then turn around and tell the galaxy that it is full of angels. We have a lot of work to do, you and I. He walked back into the shadows, leaving me alone with the view of the sprawling, suffering city. The wind howled around the spire, carrying the sound of 1 billion souls singing praises to a carrion lord. I didn't weep. I didn't pray. I simply adjusted my collar and turned back to the city. The war would continue. It always did. Thank you for walking this path of heresy with me. It is not an easy thing to look into the dark and refuse to blink. If you made it this far, you carry the same burden I do now, the knowledge that sometimes the only way to save the light is to master the shadows. If you believe that the truth is worth the price of your soul, or if you simply want to see where this dark crusade leads us next, do not leave this channel in silence. Smash that subscribe button. Join the congregation. The Inquisition is watching, and they are always looking for new recruits. Will you stand with me, or will you let the silence win?